Welcome to another episode of Camera Photo Talk podcast. Today is the beginning of a new edition. It is Frontline Reporting, which is a new series I'm threading through the Camera Photo Talk podcast, where I talk to photographers who are working on the front line of either their projects or as part of work as working photographers on the front line, covering news, conflicts and documentary projects. Today's guest is photographer Jamie Wiseman, who's been a news photographer for over 30 years. He started at the National News Agency. How long have you worked for the Daily Mail, Jamie?
Oh, it's 25 years.
25 years. He's covered conflicts in Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. He's covered news and stories and worked in over 140 countries. He's just arrived back from Ukraine. I'd like to welcome Jamie to the podcast. Hi, Jamie.
Hello, thank you.
Jamie, obviously, I want to talk about your time and your experience in Ukraine. You've just arrived back, but you're going back out there.
Yeah, potentially next week. This isn't over by a long stretch of the imagination. I don't know when this is going to be listened to, but at the moment, the second phase, according to Zelensky, started last night. So Kyiv was under bombardment, then it calmed down a bit, and people started to return to their homes, and now the second phase over in the east has commenced.
How long were you out there for the last stint?
It was just over 6 weeks.
It's quite a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, it is longer than is ideal, but we were there and there was stuff to report, and for various reasons it's quite difficult to get people in. There's not a lot of people actually, strangely, that want to volunteer to do it, but we're there 6.5 weeks.
There's quite a difference between covering a news event and a conflict, isn't there? I guess it's quite a sort of different drama, different theatre, isn't it?
You're always immersed in the story you're on rather. When you're abroad, you're sent there to work, and you work as many days, 6 days a week, 7 days a week. You're very often on a running news story, filing every day. So there's no difference there. But the intensity and the intensity of being in that kind of environment is quite draining. Going to bed to the sound of air raid sirens and hearing the thumps in the background of the shelling on the, and you don't know how far away it is. It's quite draining, but you've got a responsibility to crack on. You're there to work, and you're there to report, and you're there to tell the world what's going on. So, but There's.
What's the feeling like when you know you've got to go out? What's that, the feeling of sort of apprehension?
Before you leave home, you mean?
Yeah.
It's always slightly awkward. I mean, it's that you cross the threshold and your partner says, "Well, I'll see you, but I don't know when." I don't know. I mean, the fear of the unknown is the worst thing. Of course, you don't quite know what you're going to find. Invariably, there's people on their way as well. Sometimes, very often, there's people who've been there already and indeed are already there. So you get a sense of what's going on. But the fear of the unknown is the worst.
I suppose a lot of your time is trying to sort out your kit, making sure your batteries are there, get your chargers ready, getting your SD cards together and your cameras, your lenses and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, my bags are always packed, whether I'm heading off to a war zone or I'm heading off to, I don't know, find somebody in southern Spain or wherever it might be. The bags are always packed, the kit's always ready. My overnight bag is pretty much packed all the time. It's just a matter of throwing a few extra things. And of course, going into this environment, it's a slightly different packing job. The kit's ready, the laptop's there, my charger's in my bag. When you're going into a war zone, it's then looking at the logistics of making sure you can work from a car, so inverters, body armour and helmet, medical first aid kit. In this case, NBC, nuclear biological chemical kit, because that is a threat. So actually, as ever with most of these things, it's a logistical exercise.
Yeah.
First and foremost, the photography, well, that happens later on, but it's the logistics of where you're going to go, how you're going to get there, have you got the equipment to keep yourself safe, and then the photography comes after that. That's just like any other job.
Absolutely. Where were you based last week? Were you in Kiev?
We were based in Kyiv. We went through Poland, across the border, went down to Lviv, spent a couple of days in Lviv. Unusually, hopped on a train down to Kyiv, and yeah, we were based. Rather embarrassed to say this, but based in a 5-star hotel, who were looking after us superbly. It's not often that happens, but it's nice when it does. The city had been emptying and was largely emptied by the time we got there. Most people were going the other way. The railway station was full of people trying to get on trains leaving the city. The hotel had its staff and moved them into the hotel to make sure that we were being looked after, and I was amongst, I don't know, maybe 30 other journalists, and production people for TVs, staying in the hotel. And it doesn't happen often that way, but it's rather nice to have a base where they're responsible for food, they're responsible for keeping the power on, and indeed Wi-Fi, which is unusual as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like the normality with it is still there with the internet and public services as well. Going off your website images and the images you put up, which I will put a link on this interview just so people can see that. There's a mix, isn't there? There's obviously the exodus, the evacuation. There's death in there with the bodies in the war crimes thing. There's the volunteers, but there's also, and the hospitals, but there's also like the bin men. And people just still working and getting on with their lives and doing it. It's a very surreal atmosphere, isn't it?
It's really odd. I mean, the thing about what I do is it's about storytelling. Now, you can go off and watch the bang bang and get shot at if you like, but there's plenty of people doing that, first of all. I mean, the most extraordinary thing about the situation in Ukraine is it's full of fashion photographers and street art photographers. I don't know, name your pick. And they have all become war photographers. They are on the front lines. They are with their mates. They are volunteering with the Civil Defence Forces. They are doing the most extraordinary job. People who got up one morning thinking they were going to go off and photograph a Czech presentation, and the next thing they know, they're photographing the aftermath of Russian shelling or the invasion of Russians themselves. They're doing an extraordinary job. There's plenty of Western journalists come in and seek that. But as I say, it's about storytelling, and you can't, I work for a middle market tabloid newspaper. We need to tell the readers what it's like being in a war zone. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to show them being shot at, people being shot at every day. But it does mean that there's room to, as you say, you need to show the victims, you need to show the hospital, you need to but the bin men as well. My colleague's idea, it was a brilliant idea. So. What's
your brief then from the Mail? What did he say to you?
Do you know what? There isn't one really. My boss is, I don't care if you take a picture, just come home safe, which is really nice of him. We're very much left to our own devices. The colleague I was working with this time around is one of the most, probably the most senior feature writer on the paper. So that gives us a lot more flexibility than to pick and choose and decide how we're going to report in a way that you wouldn't necessarily get if you're doing straight news. So it means that he's doing longer read and has, we've got a bit more autonomy about what we want to do. It's different in different situations, and very often you're doing the battle because one side or the other is gaining ground or losing ground, and then you're doing the aftermath of the battle, and there's quite a clear, this is what the news story of the day is, and you have to cover that. But in this context, we have a lot more freedom to say, well, yes, they're still fighting on the outskirts of town. If we go there, we're almost certainly going to get shot at. But I tell you what, let's go and find the 9-year-old and the 16-year-old volunteer down at the railway station who are handing out sandwiches to refugees. The bin men. There's another one. We went to the zoo. I mean, it's a bit off the wall, but how is the zookeeper keeping his animals fed? It's not bang bang. It's not roughy tufty war photography, but it's valid in my opinion.
I mean, you're a seasoned pro, so you know what's expected of you when you're out there as well, don't you?
Yeah, a running news story is a running news story. I mean, the imagination comes when you're trying to think of different ways to present what's going on.
Are you assigned with a journalist?
There's a handful of people who do it for the paper, and I worked with all of them.
What about fixers? Have you got fixers on the ground?
We thought we had when we arrived in Kyiv, and 2 days later she was dragged away by a boyfriend because it was too dangerous for her to stay. Wow. So we found ourselves without a fixer quite quickly. we'd met a guy down at the railway station putting his family on the train to send them to safety. He spoke good English, good English. And so we went back to him and said, "Oi, come and work for us." So we did. He's a data analyst. Really nice guy. Didn't know the first thing about what we do for a living. So the whole thing was a massive learning curve for him, and it's often like that. But no, he was great.
What's your plate on your car? Is it Polish car or Ukrainian car?
We found a local 26-year-old, another great guy who had the most unsuitable car. It worked most of the time, and we probably had more punctures than the average car would have had, and it broke down a couple of times. But hey, it's a part of the fun of these things. So yeah, we had a local driver as well.
Take me through your daily routine.
You get up, you have breakfast, sniff the air, see what's going on. Always read the papers, because I need to know, I want to know, and need to know where my colleagues have been and what the paper has used and what others have used. Invariably, by the time I get up in the morning, I'll have seen what my own paper is using. But that's par for the course. Chat with the security teams downstairs, and what road's good, what road's bad, where people have run into trouble, where they can get to. Chat with the fixers and see what they're hearing. Get a sense of developments overnight where we might be interested in going. Decide what we're going to do and hopefully get out early and get it done. In this situation, as I said before, we were coming back to base for tea, so coming back to base to file and dinner, and then start it all over again. It's quite luxurious to be able to sort of do day trips from a hotel, but that's what we were doing this time.
So you're sourcing local news. Are you getting news fed from London as well?
Yeah, it's a combination of things. I mean, in this case, you've got the wires, you've got Reuters filing and AP and AFP, and they're fed by local teams of local journalists, so they know what's going on. You've got, for goodness sake, you've got Twitter. Yeah. Most things, one of the modern delights when you hear a big boom is you go on Twitter, and invariably within about 2 minutes somebody said what it was and where it was. Not so much now. That stopped in the Ukraine because they were worried it was giving away information to the Russians, but done that in recent years. Sitting in a hotel in Kabul, for example, and the windows start rattling from a massive car explosion, and within a couple of minutes, somebody's photographed their broken windows and said it was down my street. And invariably, you get to know about these things much more quickly than you ever did.
What sort of kit are you using, and what's your outfit? You've got a flak jacket on, I presume, and a hat.
Yeah. A flak jacket, which in days gone by was just a bit of Kevlar and a plate, and these days is now a sort of almost like a tactical vest. Ideally, it would be in blue, but as it happens, mine's black. Yeah. But you're carrying a medical first aid kit, tourniquets, battle dressings, and some, I forgot what it's called, but you basically pour it in a hole and then wrap it up. So the bare minimum of a first aid kit on your body, on your flak jacket, pens, torches, the kind of stuff that you would need if you suddenly found yourself in a ditch and having to help a colleague or help yourself. In terms of a photographic kit, actually I'm quite lazy when it comes to this. I've got a wonderful little Fuji, an X Pro 2, and up until about halfway through this trip, a 10 to 24, I think it is, millimeter zoom lens, and then a D5, what I call the lazy lens, of 28 to 300. And then, generally speaking, either in the car or in a hotel room, or usually on my back, I've got a 500 f4, which is a stunning lens, and a spare body, generally. I've got a flash in the bag. I don't think I use it on this trip, and I tend not to take it out on a daily basis. But the thing about that combination of gear is it's light, and you've got the little Fuji goes around your neck without breaking it, and the D5 clips onto my body armour, and it means that my hands are free if I do need to scramble into a ditch or out of a ditch, and above all, if I do end up having to walk home because the car's been blown up, I can do.
How do you eat through the day? I know that might sound like a stupid question. You're out and about and you're in a situation.
No, it's not a daft question. Generally speaking, one of the first things I would do when we've got a car and a driver is fill it up with bottles of water and make sure there's things like Mars bars in there, because sometimes you're going to get closed, are you going to get stuck somewhere? You go down a road, and before you know it, the road behind you's been closed for one reason or another, an attack or a bombing or whatever it might be. So you need to have a bare minimum stuff in the car. Always stick a Mars bar in the flak jacket, so I've got something if I need it. I have to be honest. In this scenario, we were back at base most days, and the hotel were looking after us. It was a worry that we didn't have to contend with. But in previous trips in Afghanistan, for example, we were catering for ourselves, going out and buying food and cooking it on oil burners or gas burners or whatever it was we were using. What were we using? Little oil burners, I think they were. Yeah. But this time around, it was much more comfortable living, I must say.
It's serious. You do have to look after yourself when you're out there. You've got to function. You've got to operate at a very high level as well, because you've got your own safety and other people around you to consider. So it's not something you're very complacent about. So even something stupid like making sure you're eating, obviously there's adrenaline and stuff like that which will take over. But we have these come down periods where being out, we haven't eaten, and you're going to feel a bit ill. And I know it seems a bit weird talking about food when you're covering a war zone, but for me, being out in situations on the field, I need to eat, and I've always tried to look after myself when I'm out there. And I just wondered in Ukraine, when you're out there, how you're fueling the engine.
I think it's a really important point. I mean, look, any job where you're doing it with any kind of intensity. I mean, look, whether it's a war zone or a doorstep outside, John Elton's house in wherever he lives, where does he live? Windsor. You've got to be ready. You've got to be ready to react. You've got to be ready to take a picture. John Elton comes on. Sorry, Elton John, isn't it? The other way around. Elton John comes out and he doesn't stop and wave for half an hour. You've got to be ready to take a picture, and that means you've got to be hydrated. You've got to
tuned in. Yeah.
Be full of energy and beams when it actually happens. Yeah, the added complication in the war zone, of course, is that you don't necessarily know you're going to be home for tea. You might get stuck somewhere, or you might be going off to a city that has been decimated, and and I dare say we'll be doing much more of that in the next stages of the war. We'll be heading off to towns where there is no food because the railway line's been bombed and people are starving in their apartments, and we've got in there because of with the help of, I don't know, a 4x4 or the military or whatever it might be. But we're getting there and we're not being catered for. We are literally eating tins of cold beans and tins of tuna and packets of biscuits for days on end.
Yeah.
So it is important, and in that context, you mustn't feel guilty about eating normally because you don't know what's going to be around the next corner. You may well be living off reserves for a couple of days.
So how are you sending and wiring your images back to base then? Is it complicated?
Well, do you know what? This is you picked a terrible trip to ask about, because of all of them, from a logistical point of view, is one of the easiest. Here we've got phones, we've got Wi-Fi. The hotel had working Wi-Fi. The phones worked mostly in Kyiv, and even, I mean, as I left, they were repairing the phone signal out of town as well. You've always got a sat phone to back up. It's called a BGAN, but basically it's what is it? Broad gain. I don't know what it stands for, but anyway, it's not as fast as we're used to these days, but you can get a picture over in a minute. Probably less, and you point it at the sky and plug it into your laptop, and away you go. It's much easier now to file from pretty much anywhere in the world, and they're smaller and lighter than they used to. My predecessors covering the first Iraq were packing 20 boxes of dish, generator, and battery, and what a palaver. These days it's a thing that's about the same size as my laptop and weighs about the same. It's really easy to work these days.
Are you generally shooting and sending as quick as you can afterwards?
Yeah, certainly the same day. I mean, the paper I work for publishes Monday to Saturday. So if we've gone out on a Saturday, we're not expected to file until Sunday. But yeah, generally speaking, we're going out and doing stuff and filing it the same day. In this context, given that we're working for features pages which are produced later. In this context, actually, in fairness, I'm not really competing against other photographers, because you're never going to beat them, because they're there and there's lots of them, and Reuters are filing and AP are filing, and so you're not really competing with them. You're relying on you getting good stuff, and to be quite frank, the loyalty of the paper using your stuff, prioritising your stuff very often. And you can drive yourself mad trying to compete with Reuters or Associated Press or whoever it is. But if you're doing your own stuff, as we were in this particular case, we went off and did stuff at our own pace, our own ideas, and we weren't competing against the agencies.
There's a massive pool of press photographers and journalists out there, isn't it? It's quite a surreal experience, I guess.
Yeah, in the early days in Kyiv, there were. We barely saw the Ukrainian photographers because they were going home. But yeah, there were a fair number. By the time we left, plenty of people who had been in covering the war from Lviv were now joining us in Kyiv, and there were lots and lots and lots. And indeed, a slightly surreal experience. I mentioned earlier, our car broke down one day, and it so happened that the government were laying on buses to take people off to see various bits of the outskirts of Kyiv and indeed beyond. Knowing that the driver had gone off with a tow truck to go and recover the car from 40 miles outside Kyiv, we hopped on the bus, and it was surreal. We got taken to Bucha, which you'll have seen lots of pictures of the main, I think it's called Railway Station Street, which is decimated Russian vehicles, tanks and armoured personnel carriers and various other things. And it was like the worst kind of photo call you can imagine, because there were 6 busloads of people. So the only way I could get a picture that I don't want to photograph as a journalist, so the only way I could get a picture was basically to be the last on the bus and photograph the bloke shooing us down the street to get what I wanted, which was the expanse of these vehicles and very few people in it. Yeah, so there's lots and lots of people there. Over the years it's changed. In days gone by, very, very long, 20 or 30, 20 odd years ago, you were the only person that had the equipment to A, take a picture, and B, get it sent. And then, of course, we've all gone to digital cameras, which everybody can use and send pictures from. And indeed, people on their phones taking pictures, even in the outskirts of Kyiv as the Russians arrived. So it's a very, very different world. You used to have that advantage that you were the only person with the equipment to take a picture and send it. And now you're competing with everybody who can do it.
Do you think there are any photographers out there on their own steam?
Yeah, there are. But the consequences of not being supported by a paper who are paying for the insurance and have security teams to advise and an extraction plan, it's a big risk. I'm full of admiration for those that do it, but I've never needed to. I'm one of the few remaining staff on the paper, so I have the support of the paper. But yeah, there are people who are going in, but it's a big call. The risks are great.
Let's talk about the Ukrainians and the landscape you're there photographing. What's the feeling like with you guys and the local people?
We were welcomed, absolutely welcomed. There was a real sense that the population, it really was, the population genuinely were grateful that we were there telling the world what was going on. Now, that doesn't always mean you can convince a little old lady to have a picture taken, but no, we were very welcome there. It wasn't entirely smooth, a plain sailing. It's a country that finds itself under occupation, I suppose, and the wars come to it. There's fear and suspicion and a genuine fear that we might be Russian spies, or that the pictures you take might be give useful targeting information to the Russians. So you've got to navigate those issues, and manifesting itself. I'll give you a great example. We went to our fixer's apartment, and having walked up the 10 flights of stairs to go and visit his parents because the lifts were out of order, they'd switched the lifts off. We're then back outside, and a little old lady walking down the street said, "I'm about to call the police. I'm suspicious of you." I said, "Well, look, he lives in this apartment. We've come to see him." But there's heightened fear and suspicion, and it's fully understood, generally speaking.
How do you think they're coping?
I don't think they themselves will know how they have coped until they've all had time to sit and breathe. And when you're in it, you're just sort of wrapped up on it, and you either fall to pieces or you're pragmatic and you crack on. It's the same for me as it is for them. The real difficulties are further down the line when you actually come home or when the Russians go away in their context, and you actually start to feel yourself relaxing, and that's when you begin to realise quite how dangerous it was, or how disturbing it was, or how much help you're going to need. To go back to your earlier question, that's the biggest problem with people going on their own, is they don't have the support when they get home, and that's a real problem. It's all very well going off being a war hero, war photographer, but actually I suppose the effects of I'm looking for the right word here. Well, I suppose the consequences of what you've experienced and what you see reverberate for maybe forever. I don't know. I haven't lived that long yet, but for a long time, that's for sure.
You're going to go back to Kiev?
Yeah, we're going to go back to Kiev and then potentially head closer towards the Donbass. Whether that means going as far as Dnipro and then doing day trips from there, or whether it means actually going up to, up. It's highly unlikely to be going up to the front lines unless we're embedded, which is a fairly modern concept, embedded with the Ukrainian military, because from a logistical point of view, it's not easy to get. Second of all, you want to make sure you've got some up-to-date military information alongside you. You want to know that you're not going to be shot by a tank if you go down this road, for example. And also, it's about people. You can photograph tanks on a long lens, but once you've done it once, it doesn't really mean anything. The thing that's interesting is the people who are left behind, or the people who are fleeing, or indeed, on occasion the soldiers. To go back to Wallace, the data analysts and the architects and the lawyers and the the bin men that didn't stay to do the bins. How they're experiencing the war, and that's what's unusual here, is that a large number of the people who are actually on the front lines are people who've left a day job to go off and fight. So that's interesting in itself.
There's a lot of volunteers as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Them two girls in the shots you've got on your website with the sort of long blonde hair and sort of, it's so surreal.
They're absolutely charming. Absolutely charming girls. The older girl, her mother worked at the railway station, so clearly neither of them have got school. But yeah, absolutely charming. And it was surreal. I'm trying to remember the quote from the 9-year-old. It was along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing here, but why are you doing this? Well, we've got to feed people, because if people are hungry, they can't fight. It's the most extraordinary thing.
It'd be interesting after a few weeks to maybe pick up on them.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure we'll go back and find them. I suspect I'm sure they'll still be there.
What happens if you're in a town or a city, wherever you go next, and the Russians come in? Would you have to leave, or would you stay?
I don't know.
Russians are our allies in the sense we're not at war with the Russians. Do you know what I mean? It's such a surreal situation, this.
Yeah, it depends. To be honest, it depends. If you happen to be out in a village somewhere and the Russians come in, then probably you either you've got to work it out as you go along. Are you putting yourself at more risk by running away? Are you putting yourself at less risk by standing in front of your car, holding a camera and saying Dobra when they arrive? It really, really depends. This is a question that we were asking ourselves as we went towards Kyiv when everybody else was leaving, and everybody was convinced the Russians were, days away from taking the city. My feeling at the time was we stay, because that's what we're there to cover. And it's one thing invading a city, it's quite another thing occupying a city, and it's certainly another thing keeping it. So even if Kyiv had fallen, there'd have been pockets of Kyiv where we would have been safe. We'd have worked out how things were going to be. So it's a difficult one to answer, because the bottom line is, I want to come home. I've got 2 kids. I want to come home and see them again. So I'm not going to do anything stupid. But on the other hand, sometimes staying put is the safest thing to do.
It's interesting, isn't it? I find it really surreal that you get a ferry from Dover And drive up through Belgium, Poland, or wherever you're in, and you're going in basically into a war zone right on our doorstep. You know, when we associate wars with Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, and Syria, which you covered, and Lebanon, and it's so far away. We have a comfort zone there, but
Yeah,
this is here. This is Europe, and this is right on our front door. And it's interesting, you know, talking about what would you do if the Russians came in. Russia owns most of London. Abramovich owns Chelsea. You know,
yeah.
it's for me, it's a very surreal situation. What's it like on the ground in terms of taking pictures? Is there anything you wouldn't shoot? Is there anything you've sort of gone, nah, I'm not going to touch that?
I think you have a responsibility to shoot everything, and that means that sometimes you're doing gory bit, and you know that they're never going to go in a paper. You know that they're, or if they do, they're going to be pixelated. As actually, in fairness to our paper, that's what they were doing. They were using it. They weren't shying away from using it, but they were just sanitizing it, which I don't mind. It's important to shoot it. It's important to record it. It's important to send it, even though you may think, or you might be right, you might think it's never going to get used. It's important that your bosses know what you're seeing. It helps them understand what you're seeing. I mean, that's not just from a point of view of them understanding what you're going to be like when you come home, but it's a matter of the editors understanding what you're seeing. That's what you're there for. It may not necessarily, what you shoot may not necessarily go in a paper. This is what I'm trying to say. What you shoot may not necessarily go in a paper, but the editors are going to shape the paper on the basis of what you're reporting, and that's what you're there to do. There's very few things that I wouldn't shoot.
What motivates you then to do this sort of work?
I think it is. I'm an adventurer by nature. I mean, I don't mean that in a gung ho way. I love travel. I love meeting people. Covering wars is a manifestation of that. It's an important thing to do. It's important that somebody does it. I'm not the best photographer in the world, but I do a half-assed job, and I think it's important that we do it. Even and I know my paper has it's not everybody's flavour, but hey, we've reported it the way we've done it. The paper's raised 10 million quid for Ukrainian refugees. It's an important job to do. You see the worst of people in situations like that, but you also see the very best of people.
Do you bring the emotions back with you? What you've witnessed, what you've seen, does that stay with you for a while when you come home?
Yeah, it does. It really does. And I alluded to this earlier on. This is it's not something. It's something that we. I mean, look, the newspaper industry, I love it to bits, but compared to other industries, it has taken a bit of catching up. Look, and even within the media as a whole, whether it be newspapers or television, things like PTSD is something that we didn't really pay much attention to, and I know I've got good friends who've gone off the rails, who've suffered hugely, and it's affected their lives. Affected them greatly. Coming back from places like places like it destroys mental health.
It's an interesting setup though, because if you're like working in say Afghanistan or Libya, you're a long way from home. You're a good few hours on the plane where you can't just sort of get in a car and drive down the autobahn. In this one, it's like going back to what we're saying about how it is on our doorstep. It's quite a surreal situation, just being so close to home, and you can't just get in the car and escape it if you had to, couldn't you? You could just go and get out and.
Oh yeah, and that's sort of where you feel a bit of a. You feel a bit of a fraud's not the right word. I'm trying to think. You feel like you're not being honest, because you make friends and you make friends and you make good friends and you experience difficult things with them. I mean, you go through experiences with people, and ultimately there's a the guilt. I mentioned the guilt a minute ago, but there is that guilt that you are going to go home and you're going to leave them to it. And the problem almost certainly isn't going to have been solved when you do. But yes, the fact that it is so close. I think from a news value point of view, it's inevitable that there is more interest in this war than there is in in further flung parts. And we're still. I think my colleague wrote this in one of his stories. He's still getting text messages from the friends that we made in Afghanistan, and how do you tell them? Well, actually, we don't care about Afghanistan anymore because we're now worried about the Ukraine. It's quite different, So that's a problem.
Jimmy, it's been really interesting, and I've enjoyed getting to understand a little bit about what you're going through, how you're thinking, what it's like out in Ukraine. Good luck and everything when you go back.
Thank you.
Please feel free, keep in touch with me, and if we'll do another quick podcast if you're out there, if you want to talk, you get something off your chest and you want to, get something out there, we'll hook up and we'll do another little session. So I'm open for that.
Yes, this is, to quote Zelensky, we've had the first stage. The next stage is going to be much grimier, much harder, much tougher, and probably for us too. We're not going to have the luxury of a hotel. We'll be living in shelled out buildings. We'll be cooking for ourselves. We'll be a bit more like Afghanistan was a few years ago. Oh, God, how many years ago is that? How many? 20. So, it'll be a different experience. So, yeah, let's talk again and I'll talk you through it then.
You look after yourself.
Thank you.
All the best, Jamie. Take care.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
We are floored, we are bound down, see us, careless corpse, see us, steal the dawn, we are storm. We are storm. See us born, see us wind down, see us fly low to our blind goal. We are storm.